July 21st, 1954, Geneva, Switzerland. Outside the Palais des Nations, rain streaks down marble columns and pools against rows of umbrellas. Inside, diplomats sit beneath the haze of cigarette smoke as signatures crawl across paper that will decide the fate of a divided Vietnam. The microphones hiss, pens scratch, and the world tilts quietly on its axis. The Geneva Accords promise peace after 9 years of bloodshed between the Viet Minh and French colonial forces. Yet peace here feels fragile, a ceasefire born not of reconciliation, but of exhaustion. Vietnam is to be temporarily divided along the 17th parallel, pending elections in 2 years. To the north, the victorious revolutionary government of Ho Chi Minh will rule from Hanoi. To the south, a Western-backed administration will form under Ngo Dinh Diem in Saigon. On maps, it looks clean, a thin red line through jungles, mountains, and rice paddies. On the ground, it is chaos, the line that split a people. Across the narrow Ben Hai River, families crowd the banks. Some carry bundles wrapped in blankets, others clutch children or chickens. Loudspeakers shout evacuation orders, while French trucks rumble south and Viet Minh soldiers wave flags north. Between 1954 and 1955, nearly 1 million Southerners, mostly Catholics, flee north to south, fearing communist reprisals. At the same time, thousands of revolutionaries slip north for training and regrouping. To the refugees, the separation is incomprehensible. The border cuts through villages, even families. In Quang Tri, a mother shouts across the river to her son as soldiers urge her onto a boat. The boy's voice fades into the rain. For the first time in centuries, Vietnam is not a single country. In Hanoi, red banners rise above shattered colonial villas. Propaganda loudspeakers promise land reform, literacy, and independence. In Saigon, the smell of gasoline and French perfume lingers. Diem's officers, in crisp American-style uniforms, salute beneath new flags. Each capital believes itself to be the true Vietnam, and each is already preparing for the next war. The Northern Dream. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam moves quickly to rebuild. Roads, once bombed by French aircraft, are cleared by peasants wielding shovels. Soviet and Chinese advisors arrive with notebooks and optimism. Hanoi's slogans read, "Independence and socialism, hand in hand." But idealism comes at a cost. The land reform campaign of 1955 to 1956 is brutal. Landlords are denounced in village tribunals. Thousands are executed or imprisoned. The campaign ignites fear even among loyal revolutionaries. Later, Ho Chi Minh himself will apologize for its excesses, but the damage is done. Yet the North emerges, disciplined and unified, a state hardened for war, driven by a single purpose: national reunification. Factories rise along the Red River. Rice yields are collectivized. The People's Army of Vietnam reorganizes, its officers trained in Soviet academies. In dark rooms lit by kerosene lamps, maps of the South are quietly unrolled. The Southern struggle. In the South, Diem faces a different kind of battle. After the French withdrawal, Saigon is a city of contradictions. Rickshaws beside Cadillacs, Buddhist pagodas shadowed by cathedrals, poverty encircling villas filled with jazz and cognac. Diem, a stern Catholic nationalist, dreams of creating a third force, neither colonial nor communist. Backed by the United States, he consolidates power with remarkable will. The CIA's Edward Lansdale coaches his propaganda teams, advising that loyalty is won through spectacle as much as fear. Diem's banners proclaim liberty and prosperity for the free Vietnamese. But Diem's government rules through family, not democracy. His brother Nhu controls the secret police. His sister-in-law, Madame Nhu, lectures the nation on moral purity. Political rivals vanish. Buddhist leaders are watched. The countryside, long dominated by Viet Minh networks, resents Saigon's corruption. By 1957, small ambushes begin in the Mekong Delta, officially dismissed as banditry. In reality, Former Viet Minh cadres who had stayed behind are reorganizing. They dig caches, whisper passwords, and prepare for a new insurgency. America's shadow grows. To Washington, Vietnam becomes another domino in the Cold War. The Eisenhower administration pledges millions in aid and begins sending military advisors. The Military Assistance Advisory Group, MAG, expands, training the fledgling Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. Helicopters land in Tan Son Nhut airfield under the blazing southern Sunday. American optimism is high. Washington analysts believe prosperity and propaganda can outshine communist discipline. They build schools, broadcast radio shows, and ship rice in sacks labeled, "From the People of the United States." Yet behind the aid is a growing fear that Diem cannot win hearts beyond the cities. In a 1959 report, a U.S. officer writes, "The enemy moves by night, invisible among his own people. We cannot fight what we cannot see." Sparks in the dark. Along jungle trails near the Cambodian border, units of the People's Army begin infiltrating south, moving supplies through what will later be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They carry rifles wrapped in cloth, guided by moonlight. Each footstep marks the start of a shadow war. In 1959, the first organized attacks strike ARVN outposts in Tay Ninh and Chau Doc. Officially, the conflict does not yet exist. There are no declarations, no battle lines, only scattered gunfire swallowed by the jungle. But the silence after each burst tells what the reports do not. The war has already begun. The last illusion of peace. By the end of 1959, Vietnam is two nations bound by one grief. In the north, children recite songs about the day they will return to Saigon. In the south, American jeeps patrol highways lined with bomb craters from a war that officially ended 5 years ago. At night, from both sides of the Ben Hai River, villagers hear distant drums. The monsoon rain blurs the border lights. Somewhere in that darkness, history turns its page. The paper signed in Geneva has begun to burn. May 1959 Hauch 559, Laos border. A thin column of men moves silently beneath the jungle canopy. Their boots sink into wet earth. Mosquitoes hum like static. Each soldier carries a rifle, a bag of rice, and a dream to reunite their divided homeland. Above them, bamboo creaks under rain. These men are the first units of the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, to infiltrate southward, following what will soon be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a lifeline carved through mountains and monsoon. Officially, there is no war. But in the dark, Vietnam is already bleeding again. The hidden arteries of revolution. In Hanoi, planners from the General Staff study maps by candlelight. Route 559, named for its creation in May 1959, becomes their answer to a divided land. It snakes through the Trung Son Mountains, crossing into Laos and Cambodia, invisible to foreign reconnaissance. Young volunteers, many barely 20, build bridges from vines, dig tunnels by hand, and haul supplies on bicycles overloaded with ammunition. Every meter of the trail is contested by nature itself, leeches, landslides, and endless rain. But these paths will one day carry divisions of men, trucks, and artillery. For now, they carry only whispers. In the south, scattered uprisings grow bolder. Small bands of former Viet Minh attack police posts and seize weapons. Their slogans are cautious at first, defend the people's land. But by 1960, the movement has a name. Mặt trận Dân tộc Giải phóng miền Nam Việt Nam, the National Liberation Front, NLF. To Washington, the new acronym becomes familiar. Viet Cong, Diem's grip tightens. In Saigon, President Ngo Dinh Diem surveys his capital from the Independence Palace. He sees himself as the last bulwark of anti-communism in Southeast Asia, austere, incorruptible, destined. But beyond the palace walls, resentment simmers. His strategic hamlet program uproots millions of villagers into fortified compounds, allegedly to isolate the insurgents. Barbed wire replaces rice fields. Soldiers search homes, arrest men without charge, and burn thatched huts to force compliance. Villagers whisper, "Họ bảo vệ chúng tôi." Nhưng họ nhốt chúng tôi như tù nhân. They say they protect us, but they cage us like prisoners. In 1960, discontent erupts into the Bien Phu rebellion, led by paratroopers furious with Diem's autocracy. The coup fails, but it shakes the regime's confidence. Diem's brother, Ngo Ding Nhu, tightens surveillance. Torture becomes common in prisons like Phu Le and Con Dao. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong expand from dozens to thousands of fighters. They establish shadow governments in the Mekong Delta, collecting taxes and enforcing justice. By 1962, more than 80% of rural South Vietnam lies beyond Saigon's control after sunset. America steps deeper. Washington's fear deepens as the Cold War intensifies. In Laos, communists advance. In Cuba, Fidel Castro rises to power. President John F. Kennedy, young and idealistic, sees Vietnam as a test of American resolve. He sends special forces, the Green Berets, to advise and train South Vietnamese troops. U.S. personnel jump from helicopters into rice paddies, wearing jungle fatigues under the relentless Sunday in the Surrey. What began as a handful of advisors swells to over 16,000 by 1963. At first, the Americans are confident. They bring radios, helicopters, and tactical manuals. But the enemy is elusive. Ambushes appear and vanish like ghosts. An ARVN officer confides to an American captain, "They fight for their land, we fight for our pay." In Washington, the optimism fades into frustration. Despite billions of dollars in aid, Diem's regime fails to win loyalty. U.S. intelligence reports warn that military victories cannot substitute for political legitimacy. The war comes to the villages. In the Mekong Delta, a farmer named Nguyen Van Dieren watches his village burn after a government sweep. His brother is accused of aiding the Viet Cong. He joins the resistance, not out of ideology but revenge. Stories like his multiply across the countryside. The Viet Cong's tactics are simple yet devastating: ambushes, assassinations, propaganda at night. They blend with the people, fighting not for territory but for time. A village may be liberated by day and occupied by night. American advisors note the paradox. We win every battle, but we're losing the war. By 1962, the countryside becomes a labyrinth of traps and whispers. Bamboo spikes hidden in puddles, grenades tied to tripwires, radios broadcasting patriotic songs. Helicopters thunder overhead, spraying jungle with Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant meant to reveal enemy trails, and instead poisoning generations. The sky darkens. In January 1963, the Battle of Up Buck erupts in the Mekong Delta. A small Viet Cong force, barely 300 men, faces 1,000 South Vietnamese troops supported by American advisors, armored vehicles, and helicopters. The battle lasts a single day but changes everything. The Viet Cong shoot down 5 helicopters, destroy armored carriers, and hold their ground. American officers are stunned. U.S. advisor Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann cables Saigon. "We have been beaten by a much weaker enemy." News spreads quickly. For the first time, the myth of inevitable victory cracks. The jungle, once thought conquered, swallows confidence whole. Crisis in Saigon. While the jungle burns, Saigon rots from within. President Diem's Catholic favoritism alienates the Buddhist majority. In Hue, police shoot protesters demanding religious equality. On the 11th of June 1963, the world watches in horror as monk Thich Quang Duc sits cross-legged in a Saigon intersection, pours gasoline over himself, and strikes a match. Flames consume him, yet his body remains motionless. The photograph, his calm amid fire, circles the globe, more powerful than any bullet. Diem's regime collapses morally in that moment. Washington's patience evaporates. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials discuss what they once denied: regime change. The fall of a regime. On November 1st, 1963, South Vietnamese generals with quiet American approval move against Diem. Tanks surround the presidential palace. Gunfire echoes through Saigon streets. Within hours, Diem and his brother are captured while fleeing through Chur Lun. They are executed in the back of an armored vehicle. The man who once declared himself the savior of Vietnam dies betrayed by his own army. The streets fall silent. The smell of gunpowder lingers as crowds gather around the palace gates, uncertain whether to mourn or rejoice. In Washington, Kennedy receives the news somberly. 3 weeks later, he too will be assassinated in Dallas. 2 leaders fall within the same month, one in Saigon, one in Texas, and the path ahead darkens for both nations. The whisper before the storm. By the close of 1963, South Vietnam is leaderless, the North emboldened. The Ho Chi Minh Trail hums with steady movement. Men and supplies pour south like an unbroken tide. American advisors now command troops in all but name. The seeds of insurgency have taken root. The next war, the one the world will remember, is no longer a question of if, but when. And somewhere deep in the jungle, a Viet Cong radio operator tunes in to the Voice of America broadcast and smiles faintly. The Americans are coming. August 2nd, 1964, Gulf of Tonkin. Night swallows the sea off Vietnam's northern coast. On board the U.S. destroyer USS Maddox, radar screens flicker with ghostly blips. The ship's captain squints into darkness thick with monsoon rain. Suddenly, alarm bells. Enemy torpedo boats inbound. Gunners swing their mounts. Tracers light up the storm. For 20 chaotic minutes, the Maddox fires into the void. No one ever confirms if an attack truly occurred. Yet within 48 hours, those echoes in the rain will pull America into a full-scale war. The Tonkin Resolution. In Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson faces cameras with grave determination. He declares that North Vietnamese patrol boats have launched deliberate attacks upon U.S. ships. Congress responds with overwhelming unity, passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the president authority to take all necessary measures to repel aggression in Southeast Asia. Few in Congress realize they have just handed Johnson a blank check for war. Behind the political language lies strategy. The Pentagon already has contingency plans, bombing lists, troop deployments, logistics networks drawn up months earlier. Tonkin simply provides the spark. By late 1964, U.S. aircraft strike North Vietnamese targets for the first time. American bases expand across the south. Da Nang, Pleiku, Cam Ranh, Bien Hoa. Engineers carve airfields from red earth. Supply ships unload tanks under the glare of floodlights. The quiet advisory mission is over. The United States is now at war in Vietnam. The first Marines land, March 8th, 1965, Da Nang Air Base. A curtain of sea mist drifts over the beach as 3,500 U.S. Marines step onto Vietnamese soil, the first official combat troops. The stars and stripes flutter beside South Vietnam's yellow flag. Onlookers cheer, women offer garlands of flowers, photographers crowd for shots of smiling soldiers. To many Americans back home, it feels like the start of a noble rescue, saving a small democracy from communist aggression. But beneath the ceremony, the air smells of mud, diesel, and foreboding. The Marines quickly learn Vietnam is not a war of fronts, but of fog. There are no fixed lines, no enemy uniforms. Villagers plant rice by day and bury mines by night. The Marines are told they're here to defend Da Nang, yet within weeks they're drawn into sweeps through nearby villages, operations with names like Starlight and Piranha. Operation Starlight in August 1965, the first major U.S. offensive ends in tactical success. 600 Viet Cong dead, American casualties under 50. Commanders hail it as proof of U.S. superiority. But for everybody counted, a dozen new recruits join the resistance. In the villages, grief is fertile soil. The rolling thunder begins. In February 1965, Viet Cong guerrillas attack Pleiku Air Base, killing 8 Americans and destroying aircraft. The retaliation is swift. Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. It is meant to break Hanoi's will, to choke the North's support for the Southern insurgency. Instead, it steals their resolve. Every day, waves of F-105 Thunder Chiefs and B-52 bombers roar northward. Bombs fall on rail lines, bridges, and fuel depots. In the Red River Delta, villagers watch silver streaks descend from the clouds and scatter into firestorms. American pilots, confident in their machines, call it shock and awe. Yet beneath them, the jungle hides a tenacity no bomb can erase. Downed pilots are captured, paraded through Hanoi's streets, and locked in the Hoa Lo prison, later infamous as the Hanoi Hilton. In Saigon, reporters begin to whisper what commanders deny. The harder America strikes, the deeper the enemy digs. Johnson's dilemma. Back in Washington, President Johnson sits late in the Oval Office, chain-smoking over casualty reports. Each folder carries the same contradiction: battlefield success, strategic stagnation. The U.S. wins every engagement, but the enemy always returns. His advisors assure him victory is near, just a few more troops, a few more months. Yet every escalation demands another. By the end of 1965, over 180,000 American troops are deployed in Vietnam. Helicopters multiply like locusts, landing in rice paddies and mountain clearings. Johnson privately admits to aides, "I can't fight this war and build the great society at home, but I can't lose it either." A different kind of enemy. In the Mekong Delta, search and destroy becomes the mantra. American units sweep through hamlets, guided by intelligence, often built on rumor. Villages are declared free fire zones. Artillery pounds, tree lines, napalm scorches, fields, and helicopter gunships circle like hawks. After each operation, generals report body counts as measures of success. The war becomes arithmetic, victories measured not in land held, but in corpses tallied. But the Viet Cong refuse to fight conventionally. They hit convoys, melt into jungle, and strike again days later. They fight not for ground, but for exhaustion, for time itself. Private James Walker, a 19-year-old from Kansas, writes in a letter home, "The jungle moves, Mom. It breathes. You don't see them, but they're everywhere. We're not fighting an army, we're fighting shadows." The North responds. Hanoi interprets the U.S. escalation as proof of its own righteousness. Ho Chi Minh declares, "You can kill 10 of our men for every one we kill of yours, but even at those odds, you will lose and we will win." The People's Army of Vietnam begins deploying regular units south through Laos. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, once a footpath, now pulses with convoys. Soviet trucks rumble beneath triple-layered canopies. Anti-aircraft guns line ridges camouflaged by bamboo. Women haul ammunition by bicycle, singing revolutionary songs to drown the sound of bombers overhead. To the Americans, these are faceless enemies. To Hanoi, they are patriots marching toward history. The war comes home. Television brings Vietnam into American living rooms for the first time. Grainy black and white images show jungles burning, helicopters ferrying the wounded, and rows of body bags. The official rhetoric of limited engagement collides with the nightly reality of endless casualties. Yet in 1965, the majority of Americans still trust their government. They believe in victory for now. Colleges wave flags. Recruitment posters fill bus stops. The word quagmire has not yet entered the public lexicon. In the quiet of his Hanoi office, General Von Nguyen Giap studies U.S. strategy. He understands the logic behind the American escalation better than the Americans themselves. They are trapped by their own strength, he notes. Every bomb they drop ties them tighter to this land. The point of no return. By the end of 1965, Vietnam is a furnace of fire and faith. The United States controls the skies, the seas, and every major city. Yet in the villages, the resistance flourishes like grass after rain. In Saigon, soldiers drink Coca-Cola in air-conditioned bars while a world away. A Marine patrol vanishes in the mist of Quang Nam. The war has crossed the point of no return for both nations. As another monsoon descends on the paddies, a Viet Cong sapper whispers to his unit. They think this is their war. They don't know it's ours. The jungle exhales, the rain begins again, and somewhere above the clouds, another formation of American bombers heads north. April 1966 over Ha Tinh Province, North Vietnam. A wall of black smoke boils upward from burning fuel depots as F-105 Thunder Chiefs scream past at 600 miles per hour. The pilots bank sharply, their cockpits glowing with firelight. Below, anti-aircraft guns crack like thunderclaps. From rice fields to city alleys, the sky itself has become a weapon. This is Operation Rolling Thunder, America's longest, most relentless bombing campaign since World War II. What began as limited retaliation, after Pleiku now reigns across North Vietnam for 3 straight years. The promise of air power. In Washington, the strategy sounds simple. Bomb enough targets, and Hanoi will yield. U.S. generals believe that modern air power can break the enemy's will, just as it did in Europe and Korea. The Pentagon's maps are marked with red circles, bridges, power plants, railways, each representing a pulse of North Vietnam's infrastructure. The logic is arithmetic. If the North's supply lines are cut, the Viet Cong in the South will wither. If Hanoi's economy collapses, Ho Chi Minh will sue for peace. But Vietnam is not Germany, nor Japan. In the jungles and limestone valleys of the North, every bomb that falls seems to deepen defiance rather than destroy it. The shield of the people. As the bombing intensifies, Hanoi transforms. Streets once lined with bicycles now swarm with volunteers digging trenches. Loudspeakers warn of incoming air raids. Civilians move underground into shelters carved from earth and stone. At dawn, women and children repair bridges under clouds of dust while flak bursts overhead. Entire factories are dismantled and moved into caves. The government calls it to turn each village into a fortress. Ho Chi Minh visits an anti-aircraft crew near Hai Phong and tells them, "The Americans have the planes, but we have the ground." The words become a national vow. Across the country, teenage gunners stare through binoculars, waiting for the silver glint of incoming bombers. They chant, "Một người bắn, cả nước cùng bắn." One person fires. The whole nation fires. By 1967, North Vietnam operates one of the most dense air defense networks in the world's surface to air missiles from the Soviets, radar stations, and hundreds of hidden artillery sites. American pilots call it the most dangerous airspace on Earth. The Pilots' War. For U.S. airmen, each mission is a gamble with fate. The sky over North Vietnam becomes a killing ground tracer fire, arching upward like molten rain. Captain Everett Alvarez Jr., shot down in 1964, becomes one of the first American POWs. Others soon follow. By the end of 1967, over 700 U.S. aircraft are lost to enemy fire. Those who survive return to their carriers with bullet holes stitched through the fuselage and nerves frayed thin. Pilots start marking their calendars with red X's not for days survived, but for days left until rotation home. The Hoa Lo prison in Hanoi fills with captured Americans. Behind its iron gates, men like Commander James Stockdale and John McCain endure years of captivity. For the first time, the American public begins hearing about "our boys in Hanoi" and questions about what they are dying for. The ground war expands. While rolling thunder pounds the north, the war in the south grinds deeper into stalemate. In Ia Drang Valley, 1965, American and North Vietnamese forces clash in the first major confrontation between regular armies. The U.S. uses helicopters to insert and extract troops, an innovation of modern warfare. In one brutal week, both sides suffer hundreds of casualties. The Americans hold the field, but the North learns a crucial lesson. Never fight the Americans head-on. From that moment, the war shifts back into the shadows. Ambushes, mines, tunnels, and attrition. The Ho Chi Minh Trail grows into a sprawling web, wider than before despite the bombing. Soviet trucks roll south at night. Women patch craters by torchlight. For every bridge destroyed, 3 more are built. The jungle absorbs steel and returns green by morning. A war without victory. In Saigon, generals brief reporters with charts showing progress, kill ratios, search and destroy sweeps, and pacified villages. But outside the capital, the countryside tells another story. Operation Cedar Falls, Junction City, Attleboro massive sweeps that displace tens of thousands of civilians and destroy entire hamlets. The Viet Cong fade into tunnels beneath the earth, their underground world stretching for miles. In places like Cu Chi, they live like moles, hospitals, meeting rooms, and sleeping quarters beneath the feet of U.S. patrols. An American infantryman writes in his diary, "We burn the village at noon, and by night it's rebuilt. They don't quit. They don't run. They just wait. The jungle swallows victories whole." Saigon and Hanoi, two worlds apart. In Saigon, U.S. officers drink bourbon at rooftop bars, watching tracer fire in the distance. They call it the 5 o'clock war. Civilians crowd nightclubs to escape the fear outside. Corruption spreads. Black markets bloom with American goods. Cigarettes, radios, canned beer. Meanwhile, in Hanoi, candlelight flickers over ration cards. Families share rice bowls in bomb shelters. Amid the hardship, the population rallies behind the war effort. Posters show peasants carrying rifles beside workers and soldiers. The message is simple. Unity is victory. Two capitals, two realities, one descending into disillusion, the other fortified by endurance. The war at home. By 1967, nearly 500,000 U.S. troops are in Vietnam. Yet at home, support begins to crack. Televised images of napalm-scorched villages and body bags erode the illusion of progress. At universities from Berkeley to Columbia, students march with placards reading "End the War" and "Bring them home." Draft cards burn in the streets. Civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. condemn the conflict as immoral, calling it a war on the poor both abroad and at home. In response, Johnson insists victory is near, but each promise feels thinner than the one before. He cannot bomb his way to peace, yet cannot admit defeat. The cost of fire. By late 1967, Rolling Thunder has dropped over 864,000 tons of bombs, more than all U.S. air raids in Korea. Yet the North still fights, and the Viet Cong still ambush convoys within 30 miles of Saigon. The Pentagon's own analysts begin to whisper what soldiers already know. Air power alone cannot win a people's war. A journalist in the field captures the contradiction. America is trying to kill an idea with explosives, but ideas don't bleed. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh's beard has turned white. Asked how long the war will last, he replies simply, "As long as it takes." The gathering storm, as 1,967 draws to a close, both sides prepare for escalation. The U.S. brings in more troops, more helicopters, more hope that technology can solve what politics cannot. North Vietnamese units mass in the shadows, their commanders whispering a single code word, Tonkin Kong, General Offensive. What no one yet knows, not Johnson in Washington, not Westmoreland in Saigon, not the weary soldiers in the paddies, is that the storm gathering in the jungles of 1,967 will soon erupt into the Tet Offensive, the moment that will turn the world's perception of the war upside down. The air war has failed to break the North. The ground war has failed to pacify the South. And the illusion of control is about to shatter under the weight of history. January 1968, Khe Sanh Combat Base, Quang Tri Province. Fog rolls across the red earth as U.S. Marines crouch behind sandbags, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. Somewhere beyond the wire, tens of thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers are gathering. The air smells of cordite and fear. In less than a week, the quiet hills will erupt not just here, but across all of Vietnam. But to understand the storm about to break, we must return to the years before it, to the simmering fire that turned a war of attrition into a war of the people. A war that wouldn't end. By 1966, America was everywhere, 500,000 troops, thousands of helicopters, and an arsenal that dwarfed anything the region had ever seen. Villages across South Vietnam woke each day to the thrum of rotor blades and the distant roar of artillery. The countryside had become a chessboard of operations. Cedar Falls, Attleboro, Masher, Junction City, each promising a turning point, each fading back into jungle silence. Yet, despite overwhelming firepower, nothing changed. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, NVA, refused to play by conventional rules. Their strategy was patient. Bleed the Americans until they questioned why they were bleeding. General Vong Nguyen Giap described it bluntly. "We do not have to win every battle. We only have to make them tired of fighting." The Americans measured progress in body counts. The Vietnamese measured it in time, hearts and minds. To counter the growing insurgency, U.S. strategists launched the pacification program in an attempt to win over civilians through development and protection. Schools, wells, and hospitals were built under banners, reading hearts and minds. But in villages, those hearts and minds were torn. American patrols and Viet Cong cadres passed through the same hamlets, sometimes on the same day. A farmer might feed one side by daylight and bury the dead of the other by nightfall. An old woman near Cu Chi put it best to a journalist: "The Americans have watches. The Vietnamese have time." Beneath her home, the ground was hollow tunnels stretching for miles, an underground city of war. The Cu Chi tunnels became the symbol of the struggle. Invisible, resilient, breathing through bamboo straws. American engineers flooded them, gassed them, burned them, yet they reappeared. The earth itself fought back. The jungle classroom. For many U.S. troops, Vietnam was a bewildering lesson in futility. Private Tom Hansen, 20 years old from Ohio, wrote home, "We sweep a village. It's empty. We leave. 2 days later, they're back. We're ghosts here, Mom. We don't change a thing." Helicopter pilots measured their missions in hours, not victories. Infantrymen counted their days by the number of ambushes survived. Operation Junction City in early 1967 involved 25,000 U.S. and ARVN troops, one of the largest airborne operations since World War II. They seized tons of documents and weapons, claimed a decisive blow to the Viet Cong's central office. Yet within weeks, guerrillas reappeared in the same area, guiding new recruits through the same trails. War had become a cycle, American forces clearing land by day, the resistance reclaiming it by night. The underground nation. Meanwhile, in the north, Hanoi planned something extraordinary. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap believed that sheer endurance had already proven Vietnam could not be conquered. Now, they sought to prove something greater, that the revolution could bring the war to every city, every town, every American base. Preparations for what would become the Tet Offensive began in secret. Under cover of night, supplies moved south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, now a vast network of roads, bridges, and depots. Whole battalions slipped through Laos and Cambodia unseen by USN. Intelligence. Civilians, soldiers, and students carried weapons disguised as bamboo poles and rice sacks. They called it Tong Tien Công và Nổi Dậy, general offensive and uprising. The goal was not just military, but psychological, to shatter American confidence and ignite rebellion within the South. The illusion of progress. In late 1967, U.S. General William Westmoreland stood before reporters in Washington and declared, "The enemy's hopes are bankrupt. We have reached the point where victory is within grasp." Television cameras flashed. The Pentagon released charts showing declining enemy strength. Yet even as Westmoreland spoke, North Vietnamese units were positioning themselves for the largest coordinated assault of the war. Across the South, 84,000 troops prepared for simultaneous strikes. The stage was set. The night before Tet Nguyen Dan, the Lunar New Year of 1968, was traditionally a time of peace, a ceasefire observed by both sides so families could celebrate. Firecrackers, not gunfire, usually marked the festival. But in the early hours of January 30th, the firecrackers were drowned out by explosions. The Tet Offensive. At 2:48 a.m., rockets slammed into Da Nang, Hue, and Saigon. In over 100 towns and cities, Viet Cong and NVA forces attacked simultaneously. In Saigon, guerrillas stormed the U.S. Embassy compound, breaching the walls and fighting room to room before being killed to the last man. In Hue, they captured the ancient imperial city, raising the red and yellow liberation flag over the citadel. For nearly a month, Hue became a house-to-house nightmare. Marines and ARVN soldiers fought through alleys under sniper fire, artillery echoing off ancient walls. Civilians huddled in basements as bombs tore through temples and homes. When the battle ended, the city was rubble, its streets lined with the bodies of both soldiers and innocents. Though the Viet Cong suffered enormous losses, over 45,000 killed, the psychological blow to America was devastating. Television brought the war home in a way no speech could undo. America's shattered faith. Back in the United States, the images from Hue and Saigon exploded across screens. U.S. soldiers dragged from firefights, helicopters evacuating the wounded, and a general sense that no place in Vietnam was truly secure. The public's faith cracked overnight. Commentators who once cheered the war now demanded its end. Veteran CBS anchor Walter Cronkite, after visiting Vietnam, told his audience, "It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate." When President Johnson heard those words, he reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The turning point. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the North. Their uprising in the South failed to materialize, and their forces were decimated. But politically, it was a masterstroke. It exposed the hollowness of American optimism, revealing a truth no chart or briefing could hide. The war was unwinnable. Johnson's popularity plummeted. Within 2 months, he would announce he would not seek re-election. The war had finally reached Washington, and it was tearing America apart. In the jungles of Vietnam, the fighting continued as before. But the sound of Tet had changed everything. The illusion of victory had burned away, leaving only questions and an unending road toward withdrawal. January 1969, Washington, D.C. Snow falls quietly over the steps of the Capitol as Richard Nixon takes the oath of office. Behind the smiles and handshakes, the war he inherits has already outlived the patience of a generation. In the jungles of Vietnam, 500,000 Americans are still fighting. At home, the streets are burning with protest. The new president promises a different path. He calls it peace with honor. But in truth, it will be 4 more years of blood, deception, and slow retreat. The weight of Tet. The Tet Offensive has broken the illusion of progress. The Pentagon's charts no longer matter. The public no longer believes them. Across America, faith in the war collapses. Funerals stretch endlessly through small towns. University campuses erupt in defiance. Draft cards burn in hands, shaking with rage and fear. Protesters march on the White House, shouting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" By the time Nixon enters office, 31,000 Americans are dead, and victory is a word no one dares define. Vietnamization. Nixon's plan is simple in concept, but impossible in execution. Gradually withdraw U.S. troops while training and equipping the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, to take over the fight. The program is branded Vietnamization. The idea: let the Vietnamese fight their own war, with American weapons and money. At first, the strategy seems to work. By mid-1969, the first U.S. combat units rotate home. Cameras capture young men stepping off planes to cheering crowds. Yet those left behind sense the illusion. Each withdrawal leaves the same burden on fewer shoulders. In Quang Tri, a Marine captain mutters, "We're handing over a sinking ship and calling it peace." Behind the scenes, the North Vietnamese leadership is unmoved. To them, Vietnamization is proof that the Americans are growing tired. Hanoi's Politburo sends orders to talk while fighting and fight while talking. The war will not end at the conference table only when the foreigners are gone. The silent front. Paris. In Paris, negotiators from the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the National Liberation Front gather around a circular table chosen precisely to imply that no side sits above another. For months, nothing moves. Delegates debate the shape of the table, the flags, even the order of speaking. Outside, reporters mock the endless war of adjectives. Inside, Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, watches and waits. He understands what few others do. Peace will not come from diplomacy alone. It will come from leverage, from force. Cambodia, the Secret War. The 30th of April, 1970. Nixon addresses the nation, his voice calm, his eyes tired. He announces that US and South Vietnamese forces will enter Cambodia to destroy enemy sanctuaries. But the truth is darker. The United States has already been bombing Cambodia in secret for a year. Operation Menu, codenames Breakfast, Lunch, and Dinner, rains thousands of tons of bombs on a neutral nation. The strikes aim to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but instead they set fire to Cambodia's countryside, killing civilians and fueling revolution. From the ashes will rise the Khmer Rouge, though no one yet knows their name. When news of the invasion breaks, outrage explodes across America. At Kent State University, National Guardsmen open fire on protesters, killing 4 students. The photograph of a young woman kneeling beside a body becomes the face of a nation's guilt. Nixon's secret war has reached home soil. The soldiers' war. In the field, morale collapses. Soldiers count the days until their tour ends. The short-timers. Discipline frays. Drug use spreads. Some platoons refuse dangerous orders, calling it fragging when officers who push too hard are attacked by their own men. The enemy seems everywhere and nowhere. Patrols wander through jungles where every villager might be an ally or an assassin. The distinction between friend and foe dissolves in the humidity. Sergeant Michael Torres, serving in the Delta, writes, "We don't fight for victory anymore. We fight to stay alive. The war isn't about communism or freedom, it's about surviving the next dawn." By 1971, over 58,000 American soldiers have been wounded or killed. Yet the front lines remain unchanged. The Pentagon Papers. That same year, another front opens in the press. The New York Times publishes the Pentagon Papers, leaked documents revealing that successive U.S. administrations had misled the public about the war's progress. The revelation shatters what little trust remains. The government's credibility collapses. Protesters flood Washington. Veterans throw their medals onto the Capitol steps. In Saigon, American officers watch the footage with disbelief. One remarks, "We lost the home front. The jungle was kinder." The Easter Offensive. In spring 1972, North Vietnam tests the limits of Vietnamization. Under the roar of Soviet-supplied T-54 tanks, divisions pour across the demilitarized zone and into South Vietnam. It is the largest conventional assault since 1968, a full-scale invasion. The ARVN fights desperately, but without U.S. air support, they crumble. Villages fall, roads clog with refugees. Nixon responds with fury. He unleashes Operation Linebacker the First. Massive airstrikes targeting bridges, depots, and supply routes deep in the north. This time, the bombers fly without restraint. In Hanoi, civilians shelter beneath layers of concrete as the earth shakes. One woman recalls, "The sky fell for days." The bombing halts the offensive, but at a cost. The world sees it as desperation disguised as strength. Nixon has bought time, not victory. The crumbling illusion. By late 1972, both sides are exhausted. Hanoi bleeds but will not yield. Saigon survives but depends entirely on American dollars and air power. Washington's patience is gone. Nixon campaigns for re-election under the slogan, "Bring us together." Behind closed doors, Kissinger negotiates secretly with Hanoi's Le Duc Thar. Each round brings the same impasse: who will rule Vietnam after peace? Then, in October, Kissinger steps before cameras and announces, "Peace is at hand." The world exhales. But the fighting continues. The war that wouldn't die. In December 1972, when talks stall again, Nixon unleashes Operation Linebacker II, the Christmas bombing. For 11 days, B-50, 2 stratofortresses blanket Hanoi and Haiphong in fire. Hospitals, neighborhoods, and rail yards vanish beneath shockwaves. North Vietnam endures the storm. The campaign kills thousands but forces both sides back to the table. The world watches in disbelief. Peace, achieved through devastation. The beginning of the end. When the guns finally fall silent in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords promise a ceasefire, withdrawal of U.S. troops, and the return of prisoners of war. The last American combat forces leave Vietnam in March. But even as they board the final helicopters, smoke still rises over the Mekong Delta. The war, Vietnam's war, is far from over. For the United States, it is the long retreat, not of armies, but of belief. The slow realization that power cannot always bend history. And for the Vietnamese, both North and South, the peace that follows is merely a pause before the last and most decisive act. May 1970, the Cambodian border. The jungle hums with the sound of insects and distant thunder. American and South Vietnamese soldiers move through elephant grass shoulder high, their boots sinking into red mud. Somewhere ahead lies the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a living artery that snakes through Laos and Cambodia, invisible, unending, unstoppable. What few Americans realize is that much of their war is being fought outside Vietnam's borders. It is a secret war, one denied in press conferences but written in craters across 3 nations. The trail that could not be killed. From the air, the Ho Chi Minh Trail looks like a spiderweb stretching from North Vietnam into Laos, branching south through Cambodia and into the Mekong Delta. Beneath the canopy, it is an empire of endurance bridges, made from vines, workshops carved into hillsides, and supply depots hidden under bamboo roofs. By 1970, the trail carries hundreds of trucks a day, supplying the Viet Cong and the People's Army fighting in the south. Every bomb dropped seems only to multiply its routes. American pilots call it the Immortal Highway. To destroy it, Washington unleashes what it calls limited operations. In truth, it is total war by another name. Laos, the silent battlefield. Officially, the United States is not at war in Laos, a country the Geneva Accords declared neutral. Yet by 1969, the CIA runs one of the largest covert armies on Earth. They're tens of thousands of Hmong tribesmen, trained and supplied to fight the North Vietnamese and the communist Pathet Lao. From the secret airbase at Long Tieng, unmarked aircraft known as Air America ferry supplies and drop bombs. American advisors operate in civilian clothes, their ranks erased, their missions denied. The Laotian War is brutal and invisible. Villages are erased in minutes. B-52 seconds fly so often that locals call them Iron Rain. Between 1964 and 1973, the U.S. will drop 2 million tons of bombs on Laos, more than were used on all of Europe in World War II. The explosions become part of daily life. Children collect bomb casings for scrap metal. Farmers plow fields still seeded with unexploded ordnance remnants that will kill thousands long after the war is over. Cambodia, the neutral country that wasn't. Across the border in Cambodia, the same story unfolds. Prince Norodom Sihanouk, the country's ruler, has tried to remain neutral, balancing between the Americans and Hanoi. But neutrality proves impossible. North Vietnamese troops build bases in eastern Cambodia, protected by Sihanouk's silence. In March 1970, while Sihanouk is abroad, his own general Lon Nol seizes power in a coup backed quietly by the CIA. The new regime immediately sides with the United States, giving Nixon the pretext he needs. A month later, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces surge across the border in what Nixon calls an incursion. They seize weapon caches, destroy camps, and proclaim victory. On television, the president insists it is only a short operation. In reality, it drags Cambodia into the inferno. The invasion drives the North Vietnamese deeper into the country, and alongside them, a radical communist movement known as the Khmer Rouge begins to grow. Few outside Cambodia take notice, but the seeds of genocide are already taking root. The war America couldn't admit. Everywhere the war spreads, secrecy deepens. Operation Menu, Operation Freedom Deal, barrel roll sanitized code names masking civilian devastation. In Laos, American pilots fly without uniforms, their missions logged as training flights. In Cambodia, villages vanish beneath napalm while newspapers in Washington report only cross-border raids. Inside the White House, Nixon tells his aides, "We can't lose Cambodia. If they control the trail, we lose the whole damn war." But each strike only widens the conflict. Refugees flood across borders, carrying stories of fire that fell from clear skies. Entire regions become wastelands where no side can claim control. By 1971, the secrecy begins to unravel. Reporters uncover evidence of illegal bombings, and the Pentagon Papers confirm what many already suspect, that the war has spilled into nations Congress never authorized. In Washington, senators call it a betrayal. In the villages of Cambodia and Laos, no one needs proof. The craters speak for themselves. The trail fights back. Despite the endless bombing, the Ho Chi Minh Trail grows stronger. The North Vietnamese adapt with a genius born of necessity. Roads are repaired overnight, bridges rebuilt with logs disguised as trees. Convoys move only at night, their headlights masked, their drivers guided by the smell of smoke and the rhythm of crickets. Women make up nearly a third of the labor force, the soldiers without guns, as Hanoi calls them. They carry rice and ammunition, fill bomb craters, and drag the wounded from burning trucks. Each U.S. bomb meant to choke the trail instead becomes another monument to its resilience. The jungle consumes wreckage, and by morning, the road breathes again. An American intelligence officer writes in frustration, "We bombed them into the Stone Age, and they used the stones to build roads." Nixon's gamble, the invasion of Laos. In early 1971, Nixon pushes his Vietnamization plan to its limits. He orders the ARVN to invade Laos in Operation Lam Son 719, supported by U.S. air power. But no American ground troops. The goal: cut the trail once and for all. It is a disaster. The ARVN columns are ambushed, encircled, and driven back in chaos. Helicopters swarm the skies, rescuing panicked soldiers as enemy artillery pounds the highways. Over 100 U.S. helicopters are destroyed in weeks. The jungle floor is littered with wreckage and bodies. Lam Son 719 proves what the North Vietnamese already know without American boots on the ground: Saigon's army cannot stand alone. The cost of silence. By 1972, the hidden war has claimed hundreds of thousands of civilian lives across Laos and Cambodia. Fields lie barren. Temples crumble beneath bomb fragments. Refugees line the Mekong by the millions, staring across the river toward a peace that never comes. In America, protests grow louder. The war that began to stop communism has instead expanded it. The dominoes fall not through ideology, but through chaos. In the shadows of these forgotten fronts, the future is quietly taking shape. In Laos, the Pathet Lao edges toward victory. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge grows from rumor to army. The United States believes it is containing the war. In truth, it is feeding it. The widening graveyard. By 1973, the bombs finally stop. The secret wars become open secrets. Nixon signs the Paris Peace Accords, promising withdrawal. Yet in Cambodia and Laos, the fire continues without him. The jungles, once green and alive, are now vast graveyards, unmarked and unremembered. A CIA officer later writes, "We won nothing, lost everything, and left the world a little darker." The hidden war, unseen, unacknowledged, unending, has redrawn Indochina forever. December 18th, 1972, Hanoi, North Vietnam. The winter sky is black and heavy, filled with the sound of distant thunder. But it isn't thunder. It's the sound of B-52 stratofortresses, each the size of a small town, crossing the Red River under radar cover. Below, air raid sirens wail through the cold night. Families rush into bomb shelters carved beneath their homes. Soldiers grip anti-aircraft guns in the snow-lit darkness. The Americans call it Operation Linebacker 2. The Vietnamese call it Dien Bien Phu Chin Khong, the air battle of Dien Bien Phu. And for 11 nights, the sky will burn. The road to fire. The peace talks in Paris had collapsed again. After years of negotiation, both sides were exhausted but not broken. Henry Kissinger had promised that peace was at hand. But President Nixon, emboldened by re-election and furious at Hanoi's stalling, decided to force an end through shock and terror. He ordered the largest concentrated bombing campaign of the war, a strike so massive it would compel North Vietnam to return to the table. Targets were drawn: Hanoi, Haiphong, Thay Nguyen, the industrial heart of the North. The Pentagon insisted it would be a short, surgical operation, but once unleashed, it became something else entirely: a storm of steel and fire with no boundaries. The first night, at 7:45 p.m., radar screens at the Bach Mai airfield light up with moving dots. Hundreds of aircraft B-52 seconds. Phone 111 seconds. F-4 Phantoms converging from Guam and Thailand. Civilians huddle underground as the city shakes. The first wave drops over 20,000 bombs in minutes. Factories vanish. Power plants crumble. The Kam Thien district, a residential neighborhood, is hit directly, hundreds of homes flattened, families buried alive. In one shelter, a mother clutches her 2 children, whispering prayers as the earth quakes. When rescuers dig them out the next morning, only the mother breathes. Hanoi burns, but the air defenses do not break. Soviet-made SA-2 guideline missiles roar skyward, streaking white trails across the night. American pilots call it flying through a wall of fire. 3 B-52 seconds are shot down that first night. The airman's hell. For the U.S. air crews, the mission is a nightmare of precision and paralysis. B-52 seconds fly in tight formations, predictable paths, unable to maneuver once bombs are released. Vietnamese radar operators wait for them patient, silent, until the altitude and speed align. Then, a single word over radio. Fire. On board 1 B-52 over Hanoi, Captain Hal Learley feels the plane shudder as a missile explodes nearby. Lights flicker, alarms scream. He yells to his crew, "Bail out," before the aircraft disintegrates. Parachutes bloom like ghosts against the flames. Some are captured, others never land. In Washington, generals claim success. On the ground, Christmas trees burn instead of shining. The bombing of Haiphong. Farther east, the port city of Haiphong becomes the second target. For 3 nights, wave after wave of bombers erase the docks, warehouses, and power grids. Ships sink where they anchor. Cranes twist into black skeletons. The North Vietnamese call it the December storms. Civilians speak of days without sunrise, only the glow of burning oil. By the 5th day, Nixon's message is clear: surrender or be annihilated. But the effect is the opposite. Hanoi's radio announces, "We have no B-52 seconds, but we have our hearts." In the bomb shelters, people sing patriotic songs to drown out the explosions. Children hold small flags. The city refuses to die. Nixon's shadow war. Inside the White House, Nixon watches the operation unfold with cold determination. He tells Kissinger, "We'll bomb them to the negotiating table if we have to bomb them to the Stone Age first." Kissinger, aware of the mounting civilian toll, argues for restraint. But the president is consumed by a different fear, that if America withdraws without victory, its power will never recover. Meanwhile, anti-war protests flare across the United States. Churches hold vigils. Veterans throw medals into snow-covered streets. Senator George McGovern condemns the bombing as the final atrocity of an immoral war. Yet Nixon's approval remains high among those who believe the strikes prove America's resolve. To the public, he presents the raids as necessary a response to communist betrayal. Behind the curtain, it is the desperate act of a leader trying to force peace through destruction. The 11th night. By December 29th, 11 nights of bombardment have turned Hanoi and Haiphong into moonscapes. Hospitals are hit, embassies damaged, neighborhoods leveled. Over 20,000 tons of bombs fall, more than were dropped on Japan in the final year of World War II. Yet North Vietnam does not surrender. Instead, it adapts. Crews move decoys, rebuild power lines, and open roads before dawn. The city hums back to life, even as the craters still smoke. On the final night, the last formation of B-52 seconds flies into the storm. One is struck directly above the Red River. Another disappears from radar entirely. By morning, Nixon orders the raids halted. Publicly, he claims victory. Privately, he knows he has reached the limit of what fire can achieve. The bombing has forced Hanoi back to the negotiating table, but at a price too great to measure: the cost of peace. In early January 1973, the talks resume in Paris. The world sees Kissinger and North Vietnamese envoy Le Duc Thar shaking hands, smiling for cameras. Beneath the politeness lies exhaustion. The Paris Peace Accords, signed on January 27, 1973, call for an immediate ceasefire, U.S. troop withdrawal, and the return of American prisoners of war. On paper, peace is achieved. In reality, the guns never truly fall silent. For the Vietnamese, it is a pause, not an end. North and South remain divided, and both sides prepare for what everyone knows is coming, the final reckoning, the return home. In March, the last American combat troops board helicopters, leaving behind bases stripped bare. In the South, U.S., advisors watch as equipment is abandoned, fuel tanks drained, and flags lowered. Across America, returning soldiers step onto tarmacs that feel alien. They are greeted not as heroes, but with silence or protest. Many will carry Vietnam's ghosts for the rest of their lives. In Hanoi, survivors sift through ruins. Children play beside crater lakes where homes once stood. Amid the rubble, a banner reads, "Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom." The bombers are gone, but the memory of their roar lingers like an echo in the sky. The legacy of fire. In the months that follow, the Christmas bombing becomes a symbol of contradiction. To some, it is proof that power can still coerce. To others, it is the moment America lost its soul. Even Kissinger will later admit, it was brutality against an idea, and ideas cannot be bombed into silence. For Vietnam, the flames of December 1972 did not end the war, they only marked its transformation. The United States had withdrawn, but the struggle for reunification had merely entered its final act. March 1975, Tây Nguyên Highlands, South Vietnam. The dry season wind cuts through the mountains like a blade. On a cracked road near Buon Ma Thuột, a South Vietnamese convoy crawls through dust and heat. Then, without warning, the silence breaks. The first shell lands on the highway. The second hits a fuel truck. Within minutes, the road is a storm of fire and screaming metal. The North Vietnamese Army, PAVN, has begun its final campaign, the one that will end a 30-year struggle for Vietnam's future. The calm before collapse. 2 years after the Paris Peace Accords, the war was supposed to be over. The Americans were gone. Only advisors and aid remained. Saigon's Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, still stood well-armed, well-funded, confident in American promises of support. But beneath that surface, everything was unraveling. President Nguyen Van Thier's government, bloated with corruption, ruled a capital detached from its countryside. Fuel shortages crippled logistics. Desertion rates climbed. Inflation devoured the economy. In the north, Hanoi rebuilt with quiet determination. Soviet trucks and Chinese artillery streamed down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, now a full-fledged highway. By early 1975, the PAVN had more men, more tanks, and for the first time a clear sense that the enemy's will had broken. General Van Tien Dung, commander of the Northern Offensive, told his staff, "They have soldiers, but no heart. We have losses, but our hearts are made of steel." The fall of Buon Ma Thuột. On March 10, 1975, 40, North Vietnamese troops struck Buon Ma Thuột, a key city in Vietnam's Central Highlands. The attack came so swiftly that ARVN headquarters didn't realize the scale until it was too late. Artillery flattened bunkers, while Soviet-made T-54 tanks crushed through barbed wire and trenches. Within 2 days, the city fell. Thousands of ARVN soldiers fled into the jungle. President Thier panicked. Instead of reinforcing the highlands, he ordered a full withdrawal, a move that would become one of the war's greatest blunders. The retreat turned into chaos. Columns of soldiers and civilians choked the mountain passes, bombed from above, ambushed from behind. Photographers would later call it the convulsion of a dying nation. The fall of Buon Ma Thuột opened the heart of South Vietnam. The dominoes were now falling south not by ideology, but inevitability. The march south. As ARVN units crumbled, the People's Army of Vietnam advanced with breathtaking speed. Cities that once took months to capture fell in days. Pleiku was abandoned without a fight. Nha Trang, the seaside jewel, evacuated overnight. Along the coast, desperate soldiers hijacked boats. leaving behind families. Refugees flooded the highways, farmers pushing carts, children clinging to truck beds, monks walking barefoot with prayer beads swinging in dust. U.S. intelligence reports labeled it a total disintegration of morale. The CIA's Saigon station cabled Washington. This is the final collapse. The war will be over in weeks, not months. Yet in the streets of Saigon, President Thiers still appeared on television, insisting, "We will defend every inch of this sacred land." No one believed him anymore. The fall of Hue and Da Nang. By late March, Hue, the ancient imperial city, was surrounded. South Vietnamese soldiers fought house to house, haunted by memories of the 1968 massacre. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of hope. On March 25th, Hue fell. The red and yellow liberation flag rose over the citadel again 7 years after Tet. The next day, Da Nang, South Vietnam's second-largest city, descended into anarchy. Thousands crowded the beaches, trying to reach U.S. ships offshore. Helicopters overloaded with refugees spun out of control and crashed into the surf. A Marine watching from a gunboat wrote, "It was Dunkirk in reverse." The sea was filled not with soldiers going to war, but with a nation fleeing it. The final gamble. In early April, Hanoi issued its last order: march on Saigon. It was codenamed Chien Dik Ho Chi Minh, the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, named after the man who had died 6 years earlier, but whose dream now guided every step south. 5 massive army corps, over 300,000 troops, converged from all directions. Tanks rolled down Highway 1 like a flood of iron. In Saigon, panic became daily routine. Banks closed, families burned documents and buried gold. American evacuation plans were drafted under the codename Operation Frequent Wind. At Tan Son Nhut Air Base, refugees camped under airplane wings, waiting for flights that would never come. The last Americans. By late April, artillery from advancing northern divisions began hitting Saigon's outskirts. U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin, still clinging to hope, delayed evacuation until the final moment. Then, in the early hours of April 29th, a coded radio broadcast crackled across the city. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising. It was the signal. Helicopters from the 7th Fleet swarmed the embassy roof. Marines formed barricades as crowds of desperate Vietnamese pressed against the gates, begging to be taken. Inside, clerks burned classified documents, while explosions echoed in the distance. At 7:53 a.m. on April 30th, the last helicopter lifted off from the U.S. Embassy, leaving behind hundreds still waiting below. The image of people clinging to the chopper's skids would sear itself into American memory forever. The fall of Saigon. That same morning, North Vietnamese tanks smashed through Saigon's defenses. The streets were choked with smoke and debris. At 10:45 a.m., a Soviet-built T-54 tank bearing the number 390 burst through the gates of the presidential palace. Inside, President Dien Bien Phu, who had taken office just 2 days earlier, waited with his ministers. When the northern officers entered, he stood and said quietly, "I have been waiting for you to hand over power." The reply came, "You cannot hand over what you no longer have." At 11:30 a.m., the flag of the National Liberation Front rose above the palace. The war was over. The silence after. Outside, gunfire faded to silence. Soldiers embraced in tears. In the countryside, farmers put down their hoes and listened to radios crackling with the news. Vietnam was won again. After 3 decades of invasion, division, and destruction, the country was whole, though scarred beyond measure. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. Over 3 million Vietnamese and 58,000 Americans were dead. But the red flag fluttering above Saigon marked the end of foreign war on Vietnamese soil. The last broadcast. That afternoon, a southern radio station made its final transmission before falling silent. "This is Saigon Radio. The city is now under the control of the Provisional Revolutionary Government. We are ceasing transmission." In Washington, the war that had haunted 2 presidents and divided a nation ended not with surrender, but with departure. The last image to leave the world's screens was of a tank rolling past the American embassy, the sun glinting off its hull, the sky above calm and blue, indifferent to history. Vietnam Hadinturet, May 1st, 1975 Saigon. The guns are silent. Smoke drifts above the city as morning light filters through shattered windows. For the first time in 30 years, Vietnam wakes without war. Tanks stand motionless in the streets, their crews staring at the skyline as if unsure what to do next. A soldier leans against a wall and whispers, "We won." Another, looking at the ruins around him, replies, "At what cost?" The day after victory, across the country, the joy of peace collides with the reality of devastation. Entire provinces lie flattened by artillery and bombing. Fields once green with rice are pocked with craters. Forests turn to ash. Nearly 10 million acres of land have been destroyed, much of it poisoned by Agent Orange, the chemical defoliant sprayed by American planes for a decade. The human cost defies comprehension. More than 3 million Vietnamese are dead soldiers, villagers, children, and elders. Millions more are maimed, missing, or orphaned. In the countryside, families dig shallow graves for loved ones lost to both sides. In Saigon, now renamed Ho Chi Minh City, families gather on rooftops to listen to the new government's broadcast. The nation is reunited. Reconstruction begins. But reconstruction means more than bricks and bridges. It means stitching together a country that has been divided not only by ideology, but by blood. A nation reborn. The new government declares a unified Socialist Republic of Vietnam, with its capital in Hanoi. Cadres from the north move south to restore order and rebuild infrastructure. Schools reopen under new curricula. Foreign embassies raise new flags. Yet beneath the slogans of victory lies unease. The former Republic of Vietnam's officers, civil servants, and intellectuals are summoned to re-education camps, promised brief indoctrination sessions, which often last years. Tens of thousands vanish into remote jungles and prison compounds. The new leaders inherit not triumph, but ruin. Decades of war have left the economy shattered and the population traumatized. Trade embargoes imposed by the United States and its allies choke supplies. Hunger spreads through rural areas still littered with unexploded ordnance. Still, the people adapt, as they always have. Women take over the fields, clearing bombed land for crops. Cyclo-drivers ferry bricks through streets lined with burned-out cars. The smell of diesel and damp earth fills the air. A generation that has known nothing but war begins to learn peace. One meal, one wall, one breath at a time. The Exodus. Not everyone stays. In the months following reunification, hundreds of thousands flee Vietnam, fearing reprisals or starvation. They become known as the boat people. Families crowd onto rusting fishing vessels and slip into the South China Sea, hoping to reach Malaysia, Thailand, or Hong Kong. Many never make it. Pirates, storms, and hunger claim untold lives. Those who survive live in refugee camps for years before resettling abroad in the United States, France, Canada, and Australia. For them, the war never truly ends. It lives on in memory in the sound of rain on tin roofs, in dreams of home they can no longer return to. The American reckoning. Half a world away, the United States faces its own ruins. The fall of Saigon plays on television screens, as if it were a funeral broadcast. Helicopters lifting from rooftops, refugees clinging to skids, an empire's pride reduced to static and smoke. In Washington, officials call it a peace with honor. But the nation knows better. The Vietnam War has claimed 58,220 American lives and left more than 150,000 wounded. Thousands return home, broken in body and mind. For the first time, America has lost a war. The consequences ripple far beyond the battlefield. The government's credibility lies in tatters. The public's faith in power, leadership, and purpose erodes. The Pentagon Papers, Watergate, and the long string of lies surrounding Vietnam leave scars deeper than any wound. The returning veterans, once young and idealistic, step into airports to find not cheers but silence. Some are spat on, others ignored. Many withdraw into isolation, haunted by jungles that never leave their heads. In the years to come, Terms like PTSD will enter the American vocabulary born from the war's invisible casualties. Lessons in fire. Both nations emerge from the ashes changed forever. For Vietnam, victory means survival, but also decades of hardship. For America, defeat means reflection and the painful realization that technology and might cannot conquer will. Scholars and generals will debate the war for generations. Was it winnable? Was it necessary? What did it achieve? Each question circles back to the same truth. No amount of power can impose meaning on a people determined to decide their own fate. As one U.S. Marine later said, "We didn't lose to communism, we lost to history." The long shadow. By the 1980 seconds, Vietnam begins to reopen to the world. The government introduces the Doi Mai, reforms gradual economic liberalization that transforms the nation from isolation to integration. Foreign investors return. Tourists walk streets once filled with soldiers, and American veterans travel back to find the villages where they once fought. They are greeted not with hatred, but with quiet curiosity. Children who were not yet born when the war ended run beside them, laughing. The old soldiers stare at rice paddies glistening under the sun and realize the land has healed faster than they have. In the United States, monuments rise, names carved into black granite on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. 58,000 names, etched in silence, reflect the faces of those who come to mourn. No speeches, no glory, only the echo of a promise that the country will remember. The legacy of a divided war. The Vietnam War reshaped the modern world. It ended colonial ambitions in Asia, redefined American foreign policy, and birthed movements for civil rights, environmentalism, and public accountability. It also redefined war itself. The battlefield had become televised. Truth itself became a weapon. The line between victory and morality blurred beyond repair. For Vietnam, the price of independence was measured in generations. For America, the price of intervention was measured in doubt. Epilogue. April 30th, 2000, Ho Chi Minh City. 25 years after the fall, school children in white shirts march past the old presidential palace, now a museum. Tourists take photographs beneath banners reading "Independence, Freedom, Happiness." Outside, veterans from both sides, now gray-haired, sit together on park benches, sharing cigarettes in silence. No one speaks of ideology anymore, only of survival. The wind rustles through palm trees where helicopters once hovered. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings soft, almost hesitant. History has moved on, but its ghosts still linger. The war that divided a world has ended. The lessons it left behind never will.